The Boeing 737 MAX 8 banked hard over Pittsburgh at 37,000 feet, its aluminum skin catching the late afternoon sun like a shard of broken mirror. In seat 23B, wedged between a sleeping businessman and a college student with noise-canceling headphones, sat a woman whose eyes hadn't left the window since takeoff. Her jacket was frayed at the cuffs. Her jeans had been washed so many times the denim had gone soft and pale. The backpack at her feet was military surplus, the kind you could buy at any Army-Navy store for $20, covered in stains that might have been coffee or mud or both. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever did anymore. The flight attendant passed twice without asking if she needed anything. The businessman's elbow dug into her ribs every time he shifted in his sleep. She didn't move it, didn't make a sound, just kept her gaze locked on the sky beyond the scratched plexiglass, watching contrails dissolve into nothing, the way everything eventually did. Her name was Kestrel Macri, though nobody on this plane knew that. Nobody knew anything about her, not the 72 combat missions, not the distinguished flying cross gathering dust in a storage unit she couldn't afford to keep, not the call sign that once meant something to people who mattered back when she still believed mattering was possible. She looked homeless because she was. 3 months now. The VA had lost her paperwork twice. Her disability claim was in appeals. Her savings were gone. She slept in a shelter in Philadelphia when there was room, and on benches when there wasn't. The plane shuddered through a patch of turbulence. The businessman woke with a snort, glanced at her with the vague distaste people reserved for things they didn't want to think about, then closed his eyes again. Kestrel felt nothing. She'd gotten good at that. What nobody on Flight 1847 knew was that in 6 minutes, the captain would collapse over the controls. In 8 minutes, the first officer would begin hyperventilating into an oxygen mask. In 9 minutes, every passenger would understand what terror actually meant. And in 10 minutes, a flight attendant with trembling hands would make an announcement that would change everything. But for now, Kestrel just watched the sky. She'd always loved the sky, even now, even after everything it had taken from her. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, turning the clouds into bruised shades of purple and gold, beautiful, indifferent, eternal. She wondered if anyone would remember her name. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a change in engine pitch that most passengers wouldn't notice, but Kestrel's head turned toward the cockpit door like a compass finding north. Her fingers stopped their absent drumming on her knee. The businessman beside her was scrolling through emails, the blue light of his phone washing out his face. The college student was asleep now, head lolled back, mouth open. Normal. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. Kestrel had spent 4,000 hours in cockpits. She knew the sound of a jetliner the way a mother knew her infant's cry. This one was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not yet. Just wrong enough that her pulse kicked up a notch, flooding her system with adrenaline she hadn't felt in months. She leaned forward slightly, straining to hear past the white noise of cabin pressure and muted conversations. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture and tired eyes, began walking the aisle with mechanical efficiency. "We're experiencing some light chop, folks. Captain's asking everyone to return to their seats and buckle up." Her voice was steady, professional, but Kestrel saw the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door every few seconds. Something was happening up front. Kestrel settled back into her seat, hands resting on her thighs, breathing controlled, old training kicking in without permission. The businessman glanced at her finally, perhaps sensing the sudden stillness that had come over her like a held breath. "You okay?" he asked, not really caring, already looking back at his phone. "Fine," Kestrel said. Her voice was rough from disuse. She hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 days. The plane banked left, a course correction that felt too sharp, too urgent. Kestrel's eyes went to the window again. They were descending, not dramatically, not in a way that would panic anyone who wasn't trained to notice, but they were definitely losing altitude. Her mind began running calculations automatically. Rate of descent, distance to nearest airport, fuel load, emergency protocols. The cockpit door lock buzzed, released. A flight attendant disappeared inside, moving fast. When the door closed again, Kestrel caught a glimpse of controlled chaos, flashing indicators. A pilot slumped in his seat, the first officer's hands moving frantically across the instrument panel. Her heart rate didn't spike. It settled, dropped into that cold, clear space where fear couldn't reach. She knew this feeling, had lived in it for 3 years straight, over deserts and mountains and hostile airspace where death was a mechanical failure away. The businessman noticed her expression. "What?" he said, sharper now. "What's wrong?" "Nothing yet," Kestrel said quietly, but her hands were already moving to unbuckle her seatbelt. The announcement came 3 minutes later. The lead flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, stripped of its earlier composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need your attention immediately. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, please press your call button right away. This is not a drill. We need assistance in the cockpit." The cabin erupted, not into screams, not yet, but into a rising wave of confused murmurs, nervous laughter from people who thought this had to be a joke, a prank, something other than what it obviously was. The businessman beside Kestrel went pale. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What does that mean?" Kestrel was already standing. Her hand went to the call button above her head, pressed it once, firm and deliberate. She felt 200 pairs of eyes turn toward her, saw the flight attendant's head snap in her direction, saw the woman's expression cycle through hope and doubt in the space of a heartbeat. Because what the flight attendant saw was a homeless woman in a thrift store jacket, with hollow eyes and unkempt hair, and no reason to believe she was anything other than what she appeared to be. The flight attendant hurried down the aisle anyway because desperation didn't have the luxury of judgment. "You have flight experience?" she asked, voice low, urgent. Up close, Kestrel could see the fear radiating off her like heat. "Yes," Kestrel said. No elaboration, no credentials offered, just that single syllable delivered with a certainty that made the flight attendant's eyes widen. "What kind of?" "Military, rotary and fixed-wing, 4,000 hours." Kestrel's voice was flat, clinical. "What happened?" The flight attendant's professionalism cracked. "Captain had a heart attack. First officer he's not handling it. He's panicking. We need—" She stopped, visibly fighting for control. "Can you help us?" Kestrel looked toward the cockpit door. Every instinct in her body was screaming to move, to act, to take control before this situation spiraled beyond recovery. But another part of her, the part that had learned the hard way what happened when you stuck your neck out, hesitated. She had no credentials on her, no ID that would prove anything. She was a ghost in the system, invisible and unwanted. If she walked into that cockpit and failed, she'd be blamed. If she succeeded, she'd disappear back into obscurity anyway. The plane shuddered, dropped 50 feet in a sickening lurch that sent unsecured items flying. A woman screamed. A child started crying. Kestrel moved. Decision made in the space between heartbeats, the way it had always been. "Get me in there," she said. The cockpit was worse than she'd expected. The captain was slumped over the yoke, unconscious but breathing, his weight pulling the aircraft into a shallow dive that the first officer kept overcorrecting in panic jerks. The first officer himself was maybe 30, drenched in sweat, hyperventilating so badly his words came out in gasps. I can't do this, oh God." Kestrel stepped inside and the door locked behind her. The flight attendant stayed outside, per protocol, but Kestrel heard her praying through the thin barrier. The cockpit was a cathedral of blinking lights and urgent warnings. The master caution alarm was screaming. The radio was alive with ATC voices demanding responses that weren't coming. She took it all in with a single sweep of her eyes. Altitude, 32,000 feet and dropping. Airspeed, increasing past safe parameters. Heading, drifting east away from any airport. The autopilot was disengaged. Every system was manual, and the person controlling it was seconds away from a complete breakdown. Kestrel moved to the captain's side, felt for a pulse. Strong enough. She grabbed him under the arms and hauled him back, muscle memory from 1,000 emergency drills taking over. He was deadweight, 200 pounds of unconscious pilot, but she got him clear of the controls and into the jump seat, strapping him in with practiced efficiency. The first officer was staring at her, wild-eyed. "Who are you?" "Someone who can fly," Kestrel said. She slid into the captain's seat, still warm, and her hands found the controls like coming home. The yoke felt different from the Sikorsky she'd flown in Iraq, heavier, less responsive, but the fundamental language was the same: pitch, bank, throttle, trim. She'd spoken this language so long it was wired into her nervous system. She pulled back gently, arrested the descent, then stabilized their altitude at 31,000 feet. The plane steadied. The alarms quieted, and in that sudden pocket of calm, the first officer finally exhaled. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Oh my God." Kestrel ignored him. She reached for the radio, adjusted frequency, and keyed the mic. Her voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. "Pittsburgh Center, this is United Flight 1847, squawking 7700. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Captain incapacitated. First officer unable to continue. I've assumed controls. Requesting priority handling and vectors to nearest suitable airport." There was a pause on the other end. A long, dangerous pause where Kestrel could almost hear the controller's brain trying to process what he'd just heard. The voice that came back was male, older, with the clipped precision of someone who'd done this job for decades. "United 1847, confirm you have a qualified pilot at the controls. State your credentials." Kestrel's jaw tightened. This was the part she'd been dreading. "Affirm," she said. "Former military aviator. Call sign Reaper 9. 4,000 flight hours, multi-engine qualified. I can get this plane on the ground, but I need you to trust me and give me those vectors. Now." Another pause. She could feel the weight of it, the controller running that call sign through his memory, trying to place it. Reaper 9. It had meant something once, in certain circles, to certain people, but that was a lifetime ago. "Stand by 1847, the controller said, and his voice had changed, shifted into something harder, more focused. Beside her, the first officer was regaining some composure. He wiped his face with a shaking hand, then looked at Kestrel with an expression caught between gratitude and humiliation. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. When he collapsed, I froze. I couldn't." "You're human," Kestrel said, eyes never leaving the instruments. "It happens, but I need you functional now. Can you do that?" He nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, I can." "Good, run the checklist, make sure I didn't miss anything, and monitor ATC. If they vector us, I need you confirming every instruction." He moved with purpose now, grateful to have a task, to be useful again. Kestrel felt the familiar weight of command settling over her shoulders. It had been so long since she'd carried it, so long since anyone had trusted her with anything that mattered. The sensation was dizzying, painful. Right. The radio crackled. "United 1847, Pittsburgh Center. We're clearing you direct to Pittsburgh International. Descend and maintain flight level 250. Emergency equipment will be standing by." The controller's voice was different now, respectful. "And, 1847, welcome back, Reaper 9. Kestrel's breath caught. The first officer looked at her sharply, suddenly understanding that he was sitting next to someone whose name carried weight in places he'd never been. "Reaper 9, he asked. "Old call sign," Kestrel said quietly. "Doesn't matter now. Let's just focus on getting these people home." The descent was textbook. Kestrel flew the 737 like she'd been doing it her whole life, trimming for best glide, managing airspeed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The first officer called out altitudes and speeds, his voice steadier now, feeding off her calm. Below them, the landscape scrolled past, a patchwork of autumn colors and fading light. The sun was kissing the horizon, bleeding red and orange across the sky. In the cabin, the passengers had gone silent. Word had spread, the way it always did in confined spaces, that someone had stepped up, that they might actually survive this. But they didn't know who. Didn't know the woman flying the plane had been invisible to them an hour ago. Some were praying. Some were crying quietly. A few were recording on their phones because even in crisis, the instinct to document overpowered everything else. Kestrel's hands moved across the controls with mechanical precision, but her mind was somewhere else. She was remembering another flight, another cockpit, another time when lives had depended on her keeping it together. A Black Hawk over Fallujah, taking fire from 3 directions, turbines screaming from a hit that should have dropped them out of the sky. She'd gotten them home then, too. Had set that bird down with 1 engine and a prayer, and the Marines she'd been transporting had walked away without a scratch. She'd gotten a medal for that, the Distinguished Flying Cross, had stood at attention while some general pinned it to her chest and told her she was a hero. And then, 6 months later, she'd come home to a country that didn't know what to do with her. The VA lost her paperwork. Her marriage fell apart. The nightmare started, and slowly, inevitably, she'd slip through the cracks until she ended up in seat 23B, invisible and forgotten. But right now, in this moment, she wasn't invisible. She was Reaper 9, and that still meant something. United 1847, you're cleared for ILS approach, runway 28 left, ATC called. Winds 270 at 8 knots, altimeter 3012. Cleared ILS 28 left, altimeter 3012, the first officer repeated, then glanced at Kestrel. You've done this before, right? In a 737. No, Kestrel admitted, but I've read the manual. His eyes went wide. You've. Relax, the physics are the same, trust the instruments, trust the training. She allowed herself the smallest smile. Trust me. The landing gear came down with a heavy thunk that reverberated through the airframe. Kestrel felt it in her bones, that mechanical certainty that the plane was configured for approach, that the systems were responding, that they were committed now to bringing this thing down one way or another. The first officer read through the checklist with renewed focus, calling out each item, waiting for her confirmation. Flaps 15. Flaps 15, Kestrel echoed, adjusting the lever. Landing gear down and locked, 3 green. 3 green confirmed. They broke through the cloud layer at 8,000 feet. Pittsburgh spread out below them, a constellation of lights against the gathering darkness. The airport was dead ahead, its runways outlined in brilliant white, emergency vehicles already positioned along the taxiway, their red and blue lights pulsing in anticipation. Kestrel's hands were steady on the yoke. Her breathing was controlled, but inside something was unraveling because this wasn't just a landing. This was a return to competence, to purpose, to the version of herself she thought she'd lost forever. And the weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. The radio crackled with the tower's voice. United 1847, wind check 275 at 9 knots, runway 28 left, cleared to land. Cleared to land, 28 left, the first officer confirmed. Kestrel trimmed for final approach. The 737 settled onto the glide slope like it was meant to be there, tracking the localizer with mechanical precision. 500 feet, 400, 300. The runway lights were rushing up to meet them, the ground effect starting to cushion the descent. 100, the first officer called out. 50, 30, 20. Kestrel pulled back on the yoke, flaring the nose, bleeding off airspeed. The main gear kissed the concrete with a chirp of rubber that was almost gentle. She deployed the spoilers, engaged reverse thrust, and the massive jet began to decelerate, eating up runway in long, measured increments. Nice, the first officer breathed. That was really nice. Kestrel didn't respond. She was too busy bringing the plane to a complete stop, setting the parking brake, shutting down the engines in sequence. Her hands moved through the procedures automatically, muscle memory and training carrying her through. And then, finally, it was done. The cockpit went quiet. The alarms were silent. The only sound was their breathing and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. The first officer turned to her and his eyes were wet. "Thank you," he said. "You saved us, all of us." The cockpit door opened and the lead flight attendant stumbled inside, her professional mask completely shattered. She looked at Kestrel, looked at the instruments showing all systems safe, looked at the runway outside the windscreen, and her legs nearly gave out. "You did it," she whispered. "Oh my God, you actually did it." Kestrel unbuckled her harness and stood, feeling the stiffness in her joints, the adrenaline beginning to ebb and leave exhaustion in its wake. "The captain needs immediate medical attention," she said, her voice hoarse. "Heart attack, possibly me. Get the paramedics in here first." The paramedics were already boarding, moving with practiced urgency. They got the captain onto a stretcher within minutes, starting an IV line, oxygen mask over his face, barking medical jargon to each other. The first officer went with them, giving his statement to airport officials who'd materialized seemingly out of nowhere. Kestrel stood to the side, suddenly extraneous. Her job was done. The crisis was over. And now the machinery of bureaucracy would take over, processing what had happened, filing reports, assigning credit and blame. She moved toward the cockpit exit, intending to slip away, to disappear back into the anonymity she'd worn like armor. But the lead flight attendant caught her arm. "Wait, please. What's your name? I need to. The airline will want to thank you, compensate you." "Kestrel Macri," she said quietly. "But I don't need thanks or compensation, I just need to go." "Kestrel," the woman's voice broke. "You saved 173 lives today. You can't just walk away." But Kestrel could. She'd gotten very good at walking away. She gently extracted her arm and stepped out into the cabin. The passengers were all standing now, gathering their belongings, talking in hushed, shaken voices. A few looked at her as she passed, but most were too absorbed in their own relief to notice. The businessman from 23B met her eyes briefly, and something like recognition flickered there, but it was gone before it could solidify into words. She made it to the jetway before she heard the voice behind her. "Reaper 9, stand fast." Kestrel froze, that voice. Military, command authority, cutting through the chaos like a blade. She turned slowly. The man walking toward her was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in uniform even though he wore civilian clothes now. His eyes were sharp, assessing, and when they locked onto hers, Kestrel saw recognition dawn across his face like sunrise. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "Kestrel Macri, Reaper 9. Colonel Richard Ashford, retired. Kestrel remembered him from her last deployment, a logistics commander who'd coordinated air operations across the entire theater. He'd been the one to authorize her Distinguished Flying Cross. And now here he was, standing in a jetway at Pittsburgh International, staring at her like she was a ghost. "Sir," Kestrel said, the word coming automatically. "Old habits." Ashford shook his head slowly. "I heard the call sign on my scanner. I was in the terminal waiting for my daughter's flight. When I heard Reaper 9, I thought I was hearing things, but here you are." He looked her up and down, taking in the frayed jacket, the worn jeans, the backpack that contained everything she owned. His expression went from surprise to something harder. Anger, maybe, or grief. "What the hell happened to you, Captain?" The rank stung. She wasn't a captain anymore, wasn't anything anymore. "Life," Kestrel said simply. "I got out. Things didn't go as planned." "I can see that." Ashford's jaw worked. "You're homeless." It wasn't a question, but Kestrel answered anyway. "Yes, sir." "Jesus Christ." He ran a hand over his face. Behind them, the other passengers were deplaning, shooting curious glances their way. The flight crew was coordinating with airport officials. The world was moving on, processing the emergency, filing it away as another story to tell. But Ashford wasn't moving. He was rooted to the spot, starring at one of the finest pilots he'd ever commanded, seeing her reduced to this. "The VA?" he asked. "Lost my paperwork, disability claim and appeals, 22 months and counting." Ashford's expression darkened. "And nobody thought to reach out, nobody from your old unit, nobody from the service?" Kestrel shrugged. "I didn't ask, didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Ashford's voice was flat. "You flew 72 combat missions. You saved more lives than I can count. You held a Black Hawk together with sheer force of will when by all rights it should have fallen out of the sky. And you think you're a burden." "I think I'm a veteran who fell through the cracks," Kestrel said quietly. "Just like thousands of others, I'm not special." "The hell you're not." Ashford pulled out his phone. "What you did today, that's going to be all over the news by morning. They'll want interviews, photos, the whole dog and pony show." Kestrel's stomach clenched. "No, I don't want that." "Too late. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, but maybe," he paused, thinking, "maybe we can use this, get you some help, get you what you're owed." The airport operations manager appeared, flanked by two people in suits who had federal agent written all over them. "Ms. Macri, we need to debrief you. Standard procedure for any incident of this nature." The manager's tone was bureaucratic, but his eyes held genuine respect. "What you did was extraordinary. We're grateful." Kestrel nodded. She knew the drill. Hours of questioning, forms to fill out, statements to give. The machinery of accountability grinding forward. But Ashford stepped between them, his presence commanding enough that the manager paused. "Ms. Macri will cooperate fully," Ashford said. "But she needs representation and medical clearance. She just flew a commercial aircraft through an emergency situation with no preparation and no crew support. She needs to be checked out before you start your inquisition." The manager bristled. "This isn't an inquisition, sir. It's standard." "I know what it is. I also know how these things go. She's a hero, right up until someone decides she violated some FAA regulation by taking those controls without the proper certifications. Then she's a liability. So let's get ahead of that, shall we?" One of the suits spoke up, a woman with sharp features and tired eyes. "Mr. Ashford, we're not trying to make trouble for anyone. We're just trying to understand what happened. For the record." "Colonel Ashford," he corrected mildly. "Retired, but let's keep things accurate. And I understand your position. But Captain Macri isn't answering questions without counsel present. Those are the terms." Kestrel wanted to protest, to say it didn't matter, that she had nothing to hide. But she also knew Ashford was right. The system had already failed her once. She couldn't afford to give it another chance to grind her down. The manager and the agents exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, the manager nodded. "Fine. We'll arrange for medical clearance and legal representation. But Ms. Macri needs to remain on airport property until the debrief is complete, for everyone's safety." "Agreed," Ashford said before Kestrel could object. "I'll stay with her." They were escorted to a private conference room in the administrative wing, away from the prying eyes of passengers and press. Kestrel sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The adrenaline had fully drained now, leaving her hollow and shaking. Ashford sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "You should have called me," he said quietly. "When you got out, when things went south, I would have helped." "I didn't want to be rescued," Kestrel replied. "I wanted to handle it myself." "And how'd that work out?" She didn't answer, couldn't. The medical exam was quick. Blood pressure elevated but not dangerously so. Heart rate steady. No signs of physical trauma. The paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, kept glancing at Kestrel like she couldn't quite reconcile the homeless appearance with the heroic actions. "You're a pilot?" she asked while taking vitals. "Was," Kestrel said. "You flew that plane?" "Yes." Just like that. No warning, no prep, just walked into the cockpit and took over. Something like that. The paramedic shook her head in wonder. I couldn't do that. I'd panic. I'd freeze up. How do you just do it? Kestrel thought about that. Thought about all the training, all the missions, all the times she'd had to compartmentalize terror and function anyway. You do it because people are depending on you, she said finally. Because the alternative is unacceptable. So you shut down the fear and you do the job. But afterward, the fear comes back. Always. The paramedic finished her assessment and gave Kestrel a gentle pat on the shoulder. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're amazing. Thank you for what you did. After she left, Kestrel sat alone in the examination room, staring at the white walls, feeling the familiar numbness creeping back in. She'd saved 173 lives today, had done something objectively good, something that mattered, and yet she felt nothing, just emptiness. The paramedic had thanked her, but gratitude didn't pay for shelter, didn't fill the void. Ashford appeared in the doorway. Legal counsel is here. Guy named Patterson, JAG officer, retired. He's good. He'll make sure they don't railroad you. I don't have money for a lawyer, Kestrel said flatly. Pro bono, I made some calls. You've got more friends than you realize, Kestrel. People remember what you did for them over there. He meant Iraq, Afghanistan, the places they didn't talk about in polite conversation. I don't want charity. It's not charity, it's paying a debt. Now come on, let's get this debrief over with so you can rest. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Patterson was indeed good, deflecting the more aggressive lines of questioning, ensuring Kestrel didn't incriminate herself accidentally. The FAA representatives were professional but thorough, documenting every detail of the emergency. The airline's lawyers were present too, already calculating liability, already trying to determine if Kestrel's actions opened them up to lawsuits or regulatory action. Through it all, Kestrel answered honestly. Described the captain's collapse, the first officer's panic, her decision to intervene. Explained her qualifications without embellishment or false modesty. Walked them through every decision, every adjustment, every moment of that descent and landing. When it was finally over, when the last form was signed and the last question answered, Ashford drove Kestrel to a hotel. Not a shelter, not a bench. A real hotel with a clean room and a soft bed and a door that locked from the inside. It's paid for, he said when she started to protest. 2 weeks up front, non-negotiable. Kestrel stood in the parking lot, key card in hand, unable to process what was happening. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because you're one of ours, Ashford said simply. Because I failed you once by not checking in when you got out, and I'm not failing you again. Because you saved 173 lives today, and the least we can do is give you a place to sleep. This won't fix anything, Kestrel said. 2 weeks and I'm right back where I was. Maybe, or maybe these 2 weeks give us time to unfuck the situation. I'm making more calls. VA executives, congressmen, people who owe me favors. We're going to get your claim expedited. Get you the benefits you earned. Get you back on your feet. He paused. But you have to let us help. Can you do that? Kestrel looked at the hotel entrance, at the warm light spilling through the glass doors, at the promise of safety and rest. She thought about saying no, about walking away, about maintaining her pride and her independence even if it meant sleeping on another cold bench tonight. But she was so tired, so profoundly bone-deep tired. Okay, she whispered. Ashford's expression softened. Good, now go inside, take a shower, sleep. I'll be back tomorrow with updates. And Kestrel, you did good today, better than good. You reminded me why I was proud to serve with you. He drove away, leaving her standing there in the parking lot, holding a key card that felt heavier than it should. She went inside, checked in, rode the elevator to the 3rd floor in silence, unlocked the door to room 312 and stepped into a space that smelled like fresh linen and industrial cleaning products. The bed looked enormous. The bathroom had real towels, thick and white. There was a TV, a desk, a chair, simple things, basic things, things she hadn't had reliable access to in months. Kestrel sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she cried, not from despair, not from hopelessness, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being seen, of mattering, of being Reaper 9 again, even if just for a day. The story broke overnight. By morning, homeless veteran saves flight was trending on every social media platform. Cell phone footage from the cabin showed passengers praying, crying, waiting for death, then showed their reactions when the plane touched down safely. News outlets picked up the story, embellishing details, getting some things wrong but capturing the emotional core. A homeless woman, ignored and invisible, had become a guardian angel at 30,000 feet. Kestrel woke to her phone buzzing with notifications. She'd powered it on for the first time in days, and now it was exploding with messages. Old friends from the service, fellow pilots, people she hadn't spoken to in years, all reaching out, expressing shock and support and disbelief that she'd been living on the streets. There were interview requests too, morning shows, documentaries, a book deal offer. Everyone wanted a piece of her story. Everyone wanted to feel good about the hero narrative. She ignored them all. But she couldn't ignore the knock on her hotel room door at 8 in the morning. Ashford was back, looking exhausted but energized. He had coffee and news. "Your claim got expedited," he said without preamble. "Full disability rating, backdated to your initial filing. They're cutting you a check for the lump sum. Should be enough to get you stable while we sort out long-term housing and health care." Kestrel stared at him. How? Let's just say certain people in certain offices got very motivated when a video of you landing that plane hit their desks along with questions about why a decorated combat pilot was sleeping in shelters. Public embarrassment is a powerful motivator. He handed her the coffee. But that's not all. United Airlines wants to offer you a settlement, generous one, in exchange for an NDA and an agreement not to sue. Sue for what? For allowing their crew to freeze up, for putting passengers at risk, for not having better protocols. Their lawyers are scared, Kestrel, they should be, but they're also grateful, so they're offering you $500,000. The number didn't feel real. Kestrel took the coffee, sipped it automatically, felt the warmth spread through her chest. "I don't want their money," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for money." "I know, but you need it. And they need to close this chapter before someone less reasonable decides to make an example out of them. Take the settlement. Use it."